What is going on, guys? Welcome to the Wednesday night live stream. Today I have the one and only Luan today. How are you doing, Lou?
Good to see you, Devon.
Excellent. Good to see you as well. So today I kind of want to talk about coral coloration as well as what kind of leads into that. And kind of the main drivers is going to be more around your nutrient level, which is kind of part of the carbon dosing aspect, and trace elements is 2 bits of it. So yeah, so it's awesome to have you. I know last time you were on, a ton of people loved the stream. So you're a fountain of knowledge. So I appreciate you coming on again today.
I don't know about a fountain. I don't know if I use a fountain, but it's nice. It's so much fun to be on the show, and I had so many people say that they had seen me on your channel and ask further questions, and it's awesome. It's a great. I think it's a great way to do this. And I got to tell you, I watched your last video about your lagoon tank and your moving of your other tank. And I got to tell you that, first of all, I think the lagoon tank looks super cool.
Thank you.
Packed as tight as it is. I don't think you should take stuff out of there. I think it looks amazing the way it is. The other thing is, as common as it is, I got to tell you, that pyramid butterfly that you have in your temporary tank is such an amazingly beautiful specimen of a pyramid. She is gorgeous. I was watching a video, I saw her go by, and I was like, that's one of the prettiest pyramids I've ever seen. She is really, he, I don't know how to sex them, but that is one beautiful fish. You should be really proud of that fish.
Thank you. I've actually won one of those for ages, and I've kind of just kept thinking about it, and a local reefer was shutting down a tank, so they had one out, so I just jumped on it. I always love a tank shut down fish because they're always healthy, they're established.
Yeah.
So that's a good way to go. So I was pretty excited to get that one.
Yeah, a lot of them that have that dark face, as they get older, there's not a nice line. It kind of fades into the yellow. And on yours, you've got this really nice sharp line, and the face is really dark. It's a beautiful, beautiful specimen.
Awesome. Thank you. Appreciate that one. I was pretty happy to snag it, so that was good.
If you ever want to get rid of it, I got a tank. I could probably put it in, so I'm just letting you know.
Sounds good. Sounds good. I actually added a few more fish. This is kind of terrible. It's like my quarantine / again, all in one tank waiting for the new one. But I also got 2 dwarf angels, which fingers crossed they don't nip on anything.
Yeah.
And a blue spot jawfish. So all going in the new big tank. So
blue spot jaws. Blue spot jaw is one of my favorite fish. They're so much fun to watch. They have tons of personality. They're kind of like a little Dr. Seuss thing, and they're always doing stuff and moving stuff, and I love them. And I'm kind of excited here because we've been working on a little mangrove experiment, and I finally got to the point where I could put fish in there, and so I now have a splendid dotty back in there, and a few Bengai cardinal, and I'm in search right now of a black long spine diadema urchin, because I'd love to get the cardinals to breed. And when the cardinals breed, after the male spits them from the mouth breeding, they in the wild often hide in the spines of the spiny urchins. So I'm trying to kind of set up a little bio, its own little biome where it kind of would work the way it works in the wild. So we'll see. But it's been a really fun experiment.
That's very cool. Keep me updated on how that one goes, because I'm curious. Yeah. I've been thinking about trying that, because mine, every month or two, they're full of eggs in the mouth, and never see babies. But I was thinking of making just using like a bunch of black zip ties and making something. There's like a little fake urchin in there as a kind of a backup plan.
Do you think that they spit the babies and the babies get eaten, or do you think the eggs don't mature?
I think they probably turn into quick snacks because they were all in my big reef full of tons of fish. That's my theory.
Yeah, it's easy enough to make something that hangs down, or put something on the bottom that gives them some place to really get in there and hide, spongy kind of thing, because that's how in the wild, they do this in the urchins. And I don't know, we'll see. The tank is in its algae phase right now, so I want to get an urchin anyway to clean it up. I need a cleanup crew in there. All right, so let's talk corals. Let's talk coral growth.
One quick 2 seconds. Yeah. All right, Derek, $5 super chat, thank you. And he says, thank you, Lou, for all for Reef. Keep doing what you're doing for the hobby, and thank you, Devon as usual. You're most welcome, Derek. And Kyle, #1 fan, thank you, buddy. Thanks for the super chat. Okay, so most people are here because they are curious all about kind of coral coloration. If you guys are in my Facebook group, facebook.com/group/reefties. If you're not, join it. If you are in it, when you join the group, I have a little questionnaire of, what do you want to learn more about in the hobby? And one of the things that come up a lot is getting better coloration out of corals. Now, a big chunk of that has to do with kind of your nutrient level in the tank. So I figure we talk about nutrients, because one thing we kind of talked about in the past, which was funny because it was a big struggle to get nutrients down. Now it's a big, some people are fighting to get it back up. And it's always this like teeter-totter back and forth, all the different kind of realms of it, which kind of makes me laugh. But I mean, it's part of the hobby.
Well, Devon, a lot of people talk about the Redfield ratio when they talk about nutrients. And it's not that the Redfield ratio doesn't apply at all to corals, but it's important to understand that the ratio itself is not perfect for when looking at corals, because my understanding is that the Redfield ratio was done on surface ocean algae, which has a very different phosphate nitrate relationship than corals do. And so what I look for is somewhere between a 1:5 and a 1:10 ratio of phosphates to nitrates. You don't want to get them down to zero. And in fact, corals can live in very, very close to zero nitrate environment. They can even thrive in a zero nitrate environment, not going to thrive in a zero phosphate environment. They have to have phosphates. And the interesting thing about corals is that the very thing that they need, the phosphates, they have a very poor mechanism for getting phosphates out of the water column. They've got a great mechanism for getting nitrates out of the water column, but they really are not good at, they just don't have a good chemical mechanism or biological mechanism for absorbing phosphates, which is the very thing that they need most.
Interesting.
So what I'd like to talk about is talk about the nutrients a little bit. To me, you want to keep your phosphate level below 0.1 ppm, but not lower than about 0.4, maybe 0.3 ppm. Once you start get 0.04, 0.03. Once you start getting down to that level, the tank is so clean that no matter what the mechanism is that those corals are using to get their phosphates, and we're going to talk about that in a second, they just can't get enough. And so I've had a number of instances where a raise in the phosphate level in a tank has increased the health of the corals and the color of the corals drastically, like very quickly. So it's a really important thing to consider. I know that up until about a few years ago, everybody was trying to ultra low nutrient level, keep the algae growth down. And it does keep the algae growth down, also keeps the coral growth down.
Yeah, it doesn't help when they both go for the same thing.
Corals are, they don't live in a sterile environment, and they need nutrients. So it's helpful if we can come up with a mechanism to help the corals get the phosphates that they need at the very, very low levels that we keep them in reef tanks. See, part of the problem is that, number one, they've got a lousy mechanism for getting the phosphates. But number two, we keep those phosphates so low that even if they can get them, they can't get enough. So I want to talk a little bit about carbon dosing, because everybody talks about carbon dosing as a way to lower the nutrient level, which it does. I don't argue that fact. It definitely lowers the nutrient level in the water column. So everybody that was going to yell at me because I'm saying it's not the reason you do it, I'm not saying that it doesn't do that. And certainly if you have a high phosphate and nitrate level, carbon dosing is really something good to consider to try to get that down. However, the carbon dosing does a much more important thing. It has a much more important function. And it is in relation to the way the corals get their nutrients. What I'd like to do is to do a little screen capture, if I'm not too electronically and technologically challenged here.
You got this.
I'm going to do a little screen capture and show you an explanation of what I'm talking about.
Okay, perfect.
So let me do this, and let me do this. Are you seeing a carbon dosing screen?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. All right, so There's lots of different ways to carbon dose. There's the vodka and the vinegar and the sugar. And then there's lots of products on the market that are specifically made for carbon dosing. And you can see I've got a bunch of things listed here. And then even pellets, bio pellets or our NP-Bacto pellets, another way to do this. But I want to start looking at, I'd like people to look at carbon dosing in a different way. And here's kind of the short version of it. So here's a graphic of a coral polyp. Now, as I've explained, the coral polyps have a really, really good mechanism for getting nitrates out of the water column. Even though they don't really need the nitrates, they've got a really good mechanism for getting those nitrates out of the water column. What they don't have is a good mechanism for getting the phosphates out of the water column, which is what they really need. They need those phosphates. All right. Now, there's this beneficial bacteria that grows in the tank. And this is in all of our reef tanks. Everybody's got some of this stuff. Some people have more than others, but we're going to call it good beneficial bacteria. And this beneficial bacteria is exactly the opposite as the corals when it comes to nitrates and phosphate. It has an excellent mechanism for getting the phosphates out of the water column. It's really good at that. It eats phosphate like crazy. And it has a relatively poor mechanism for getting nitrates out of the water column. Okay, so here's our beneficial bacteria. He goes around the tank. You have to excuse my graphics. All right, so he goes around the tank and he eats a bunch of phosphates. And so now he's got that phosphate inside of him. All right, this is going to bring the phosphate level down in the water column. They take it out of the water column, so that now the phosphate is internal. So you're going to see your phosphate level go down. Okay, Now we bring in our coral polyp. And the bacteria goes floating around the tank. Now, this bacteria has the phosphate in it, and the corals are filter feeders. So when the corals eat the bacteria, they ingest the bacteria and the phosphate that's inside of them. Now, I want you to also notice I got a little guy up here. He escaped. He is there to represent that not all of this bacteria is going to go inside corals. Some of it's going to end up in the water column and get skimmed out by the protein skimmer or taken out by your filter. So that is part of the nutrient export, is getting it out through the protein skimmer and through the filter. And some of that phosphate export goes from the water column into the coral when the coral eats the bacteria. Now, because the phosphate was in the bacteria and the coral ate the bacteria, this maintains that low phosphate level out in the water column. We never let the phosphates get back out into the water column. Okay. Now, because the coral polyp has gotten the phosphates that it desperately needs, that it couldn't get any other way, it starts to grow and multiply and fatten up, and it's going to take more nitrates because it's got a really good mechanism for that. It's going to take more nitrates out of the system as it grows and multiplies. Now, I'm not meaning to say here that the bacteria doesn't take any nitrates out of the water column, and that the coral polyps don't take any phosphates out of the water column. They all do, but in general, the bulk of the phosphates are taken out by the bacteria that gets eaten by the corals. And as the corals grow, they will also then take more nitrates out of the system. And that, to me, is the really crucial, important thing that carbon dosing does. Yes, it lowers the phosphate and nitrate level, but more importantly, it's going to increase the health and the colors of the corals, because it allows the corals, it gives the corals a mechanism to get that phosphate that it desperately needs. And these are just some funny slides. So, the problem with much of the carbon dosing that's out there on the market is that it doesn't address the phosphate level. It basically says you want to do carbon dosing, you want to lower your nutrient level, you throw a bunch of this in the tank. And not all polymers are created equal when it comes to the bacteria. You can actually target certain types of beneficial bacteria by the different types of organic carbon compounds that you're using. So what Tropic Marin does, and again, I told you I'm going to get a little producty here, but what Tropic Marin does is to give a product for the different phosphate levels. Now, there's two products you can use at any phosphate level. So here's the first one. And this does not matter what phosphate level, because instead of being an alcohol or an acid polymer, this is a polymer that comes from seaweed. It's a naturally occurring long-chain marine polymer from seaweed. It's a very gentle form of carbon dosing that can be used at any phosphate level. And it's a powder that you hydrate and then throw in the tank. We use the same type of polymer in our pellets. And if you ever look at our pellets as opposed to other pellets on the market, you'll see they look very, very different. And again, it can be used at any phosphate level. And the advantage of pellets is that once you get your fluidized bed running and the pellets are doing their job, all you really need, it kind of does it itself, and all you need to do is every 6 or 8 months put a few more pellets in there because they get consumed. And so it kind of runs on its own. I love the pellet approach because it's a very low maintenance way of doing this.
Now, question on that. I've never done the pellets. I've always been a bit wary because I always hear if you have a power outage or something happens and there's potential for it to cause havoc on your tank. Is that still a concern?
Do you have me back again now, by the way?
Yeah, you're all back.
Okay. So the answer to your question is this. Mm-hmm. If you overdose any type of aggressive carbon dosing, you start to feed the bad guys along with the good guys.
Yeah.
And the reason the bad guys are the bad guys is because they grow more aggressively than the good guys. And so they take over. Things like green hair algae, cyanobacteria, bryopsis. These are things that once they get a hold and they start to grow, it's really hard to beat them back. There's a balance here. So depending on the type of polymer that you're putting in the tank, that will largely determine how easy it is to hit that overdosing stage where you're feeding the bad guys.
Okay.
It's very easy to hit that stage with things like vodka and vinegar and sugar. Really, really easy. Most of the pellets that are on the market are made from a polymer from either potatoes or corn. And in fact, it's a biodegradable. Many of the pellets are a polymer bead that is the same type of polymer, same plastic that's used to make disposable utensils, recyclable utensils that'll break down. And if you use way too many of those type of pellets, yes, you will overdose the tank and you will start to grow the bad guys. The Tropic Marin pellets are made of that polymer from seaweed, and it is harder to overdose them. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but
less likely.
I actually did a test when we first came out with these pellets, where I did a double dose. I used twice as many as I was supposed to for the water volume that I had, and I did not run into an issue. I'm not suggesting you do that. I'm just saying it's much harder to overdose those pellets than some other kinds of pellets.
Okay. Quick question from the chat. They're saying, should carbon dosing be done while using a turf scrubber or a refugium? Does it make any difference?
Well, interesting question. In general, a turf scrubber or a refugium where you're growing some type of macroalgae, don't get me wrong, I love them. I think they're a fantastic way to go. If I had the ability to do it, I would do it. I think it's a really good approach. There is a downside, though. And most of the people that I know that are running either a turf scrubber or a refugium with some type of macroalgae in it, the problem that they have is the nutrient level is too low already. The algae will grow so quickly and so aggressively and suck so many nutrients out of the water. I know a lot of people that are fighting with pulling algae out of their refugium and still dosing nitrates and phosphates because they're not registering any at all. And so if you carbon dose along with a refugium that has algae in it or a turf scrubber, you're kind of doing two things that are augmenting themselves and driving your nutrient level down even further. So
Okay.
you have to watch the nutrient level. And if you've got a turf scrubber or a refugium, you have to watch your nutrient level very carefully anyway, because it tends to push the system to an ultra low nutrient rather than, I make the distinction between ultra low nutrient where everything is almost zero and low nutrient where things are at kind of the bottom range of the optimum range.
So would you consider the kind of 0.4 phosphates to be on the low side? Like, because I think 0.4 to 0.9 was kind of what we said earlier was roughly the happy zone.
Yeah, I think that 0.4 is starting to approach the dangerously low zone. It's still okay, but it starts to get down into the really low. Maybe we need to think about having a little more phosphate in the system.
Okay, that's good to know. One other quick question.
Yeah.
Reef Keeper is asking, question for Lou. If you're maintaining a steady phosphate level without carbon dosing, can't you achieve the same with the coral color?
Well, coral color is going to depend on a lot of different things. The carbon dosing and the phosphate content concentration is only one of those factors. Can you maintain good coral color with a low phosphate level? Absolutely. But you're also going to see lots of systems that will not have good coral color if the phosphate is too low because of other depletions in the tank as well. We're going to talk about trace elements in a minute. So the answer to that really depends on your system and how your particular system is running. And unfortunately, that ends up being the answer to a lot of these questions, because I've seen systems run and look fantastic in parameters that I thought were crazy. So I never say you can't do that. It depends on your system.
Okay. No, that makes sense. Was this also going to ask? If you are testing PO3 and there isn't any in the water column alone without bacteria that then contains the PO3, what is being measured or checking phosphates for phosphorus and phosphorus? I think they're asking, could it be reading lower because the bacteria is eating it up, but it's actually there in the bacteria? I think that's what they're trying to ask.
It can. And in fact, you'll see this happen sometime in in tanks that have a lot of algae growth, where the algae is sucking every bit of phosphate out of the water, and it's in the phosphate's in the algae, but it's causing the phosphate that's normally in the tank to be close to zero. You see this happen all the time. And in fact, that's a very, very difficult situation because you have to stop feeding the algae its phosphate, but you don't want to have zero phosphate for the corals. And that's one of those situations where you really have to fight for a few months to get over it.
Okay.
So yes, that can happen. And you have to know how your system runs and kind of know what's going on. But in general, the carbon dosing, the bacteria that grows from carbon dosing, in my experience in general, won't take the phosphate to zero. It'll lower the phosphate, but it won't take it down to zero.
Okay. Okay. Now I have another question for you, because I know Tropic Marin has multiple types of carbon dosing, right? And some of it's based on whether you have higher or lower phosphates.
Right.
So explain a little bit when you'd want to use which ones and what situations. Like, what's the overview of that?
Super. And that's where I'm going with my little graphic thing next. So I'm going to recapture that because that's exactly where we go next. So let me go back to that. And do you have that NP-Bacto pellets back again?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, great. So the NP-Bacto pellets and the Reef Actif can be used, as I said, at any phosphate concentrations. Now we get into the different phosphate concentrations. So the first product is Elima NP. This is very similar. I'm not going to say the same, but it's very similar to like vodka or vinegar or sugar dosing. It's similar to most of the other carbon dosing products that are on the market, and it's made to be used when you have a high phosphate concentration, greater than 0.1. So we're outside of the range that we'd like to be in. We really need to lower that range. A limit NP is the way to go. Now, I like this better than a vodka or vinegar approach because it is a different kind of polymer, even though it's still an acid sugar type of thing. It's a different kind of polymer that really does a good job in targeting the specific beneficial bacteria that we're trying to grow in a reef aquarium.
Okay, I have a quick question. Is there actually any way of targeting a certain bacteria, like good or bad, or a way to tell? Because I know you're feeding it, but how do you know what you're feeding? Or is it just you're feeding everything and you're just hoping you have more good guys than bad guys?
Well, Hans-Werner Balling, from the Balling method, is the guy that's taught me all about this. And he explains to me that different polymers will be selected by different bacteria. And in fact, he sent me an article that showed where people did radioactive tagging of certain compounds, and it definitively showed that the different types of bacteria that are in the seawater they're very selective feeders, and they feed on certain types of organic polymers, carbon compounds, and so depending on the type of carbon compound you put in, you do a better job of targeting one type of bacteria over another. Now, that isn't to say that if you vastly overdosed a limit NP that you wouldn't grow any bad guys, because you would, because there's a lot of overlap. But in general, it is valid to say that certain types of bacteria in the aquarium will selectively feed on certain types of carbon compounds. And so by giving them the right kind of carbon compounds, you can really target the ones that you want to grow, the beneficial ones.
Okay, no, that makes sense. Thanks for explaining that one.
All right. Okay. So the limit NP, that's for, again, you got a high phosphate level. You want to really get it down 0.1 or above. Now, let's say you're down in the range that you want to be in. So here we are, 0.1 down to 0.03. Now, the interesting thing about that range is that very often now the nitrate phosphate balance will get screwed up within that optimum range. And so what NP-Bacto balance does is to add a certain amount of the nitrates and the phosphates in order to maintain that balance of that 1:5 or 1:10 ratio between the nitrates and the phosphates, where you really keep everything in the sweet spot. So you're actually adding a small amount of nitrates and phosphates with the NP-Bacto balance to help your system stay balanced and stay in that optimum range.
Okay, nice.
Right? Then we get down into where you're under the optimum range. Here we are under 0.03. Now we really need to add a significant amount of nitrates and phosphates, or else the carbon dosing solely goes to feed the bad guys, because we don't have enough phosphates and nitrates to foster the growth of the good guys. And this is when the plus NP comes into play, where you really are, in addition to the carbon dosing, you're adding plus NP, you're adding nitrates and phosphates, so the carbon dosing that you're putting in can do the job that it needs to do.
Okay.
All right. The thing you don't want to go do is go dump a bunch of vinegar or vodka or sugar into a system that's already under 0.03.
So we'd just be driving that down to nothing, which would be harmful to your corals and stress them out more.
And grow a bunch of stuff you don't want to grow. All right.
Now, I'm going to throw this one out because I've kind of seen a couple of people mention cyano, and I have seen from doing too much carbon dosing, I have seen that kind of bring out cyano in a few things. So cyano
is one of the things. You have me back again, right?
Yeah, you're back.
Wow, I'm just technically zipping tonight.
You are an IT master over there. Great.
Cyano is one of those things. It's actually one of the most common things that you're going to grow if you overdo the carbon dosing. So if you've got a 0.02 phosphate level and you start dumping vinegar or sugar in the tank, don't complain if you start to grow a bunch of cyanobacteria.
Okay. In the chat, Derek's asking, Lou, could I use plus NP with an algae turf scrubber then?
Depends on what your phosphate level is maintaining with the algae scrubber. If your phosphate level is extremely low because of the algae scrubber, the plus NP would help, absolutely. But I'm going to also say you got to play the other side of the field and rip some of that algae out of there so that you can slow down the nutrient absorption. Because if the phosphate level stays too low, there's no way you can dose enough of the plus NP to get it up high enough to grow the good guys. So whenever you have an algae scrubber, turf scrubber, or you're growing,
Macrorefugium,
macrorefugium, you need to keep an eye on that phosphate level, and it starts to get too low, under 0.3, 0.03, certainly under 0.02. It's the easiest thing in the world. Go in there, rip a bunch of that stuff out of there, give it to your friend next door, let him start a little refugium himself.
Perfect. All right, so tone it down. If your nutrients are too low, then a little more success dosing. Yeah, Derek was just saying his are 0, so you definitely need to get those a little higher.
Yeah, I would rip some of those guys out of there.
Yep. Guy, talk to this guy at Reefapalooza Chicago. Super nice guy. Yes, he is. No, Lou's awesome. All right. Okay, so we got nutrients. So happy range. Okay, so actually phosphate. So 0.04 to 0.9, happy zone. 0.6 right in the smack dab in the middle is probably a good target. We didn't really touch on nitrates too much, but what level do you generally recommend?
Again, about somewhere between 5 and 10 times whatever your phosphate level is. So if you're running a 0.1 phosphate level, you want to run about a 1 or a 1.5 nitrate level. Okay. Not much higher than that.
Okay.
That's in a perfect world. I know tons of tanks that run at 0.05 phosphates with a 3 or 4 ppm nitrate level and look fantastic. I can't emphasize enough that it always depends on your particular system, and nobody can tell you what's right for your system. All we can do as companies that do research is to tell you that in our research, this is what we see as the optimum ranges, and use that as a starting point to figure out what your system wants to be.
Okay, that makes sense.
All right.
So we got nutrients down. The other half of the equation is trace elements.
Trace elements. Now, I learned a really interesting thing about trace elements last year that I'd like to share with you guys. Okay. So I had somebody sent me a picture of a coral, and it had unbelievable color. And it looked photoshopped. So I sent the picture to my guys in the lab, and I said, is this picture photoshopped? And they looked at it, and they came back to me, and they said, it's probably not photoshopped. It probably is due to a glut of trace elements. Well, that started a huge discussion because I needed to understand what a glut of trace elements meant. And what they meant was this, and this is how they explained it to me, though I have to preface this by saying, I don't know for sure if this is 100% true, but I have seen trace elements make a big difference in corals. And what they explained to me is that if I have a coral and I give it way too many trace elements, the very first thing that happens is that there's an explosive growth of the zooxanthellae within the coral polyps. And that explosive growth causes them to have this amazing color. And for a week or two, they'll look like the most amazing corals you've ever seen. Then what happens is the coral polyp does not have the ability to maintain that much zooxanthellae inside within it. It can't feed it.
Mm-hmm.
And so the coral polyp ends up starving and dying. And so the trace elements. So what I took away from that was not that, oh my goodness, we can kill corals with trace elements. What I took away from that was how much difference trace elements and the right trace elements can make in the colors of the corals.
Mm-hmm.
I had no idea they could make that much difference. Now, whether that's whole thing with the zooxanthellae exploding and killing the coral polyp in time is with too many trace elements is true or not. And I think that in the average addition of trace elements, you're nowhere near the amount that can kill a coral.
Mm-hmm.
You're more likely to grow bad guys first. But there is something that we know that's very cool about trace elements. Number one, they definitely increase colors of corals. They're not the only thing. And sometimes you'll add trace elements and it doesn't influence the color. Might be potassium or magnesium or one of the other million things that we need to look at. But what's cool about trace elements is this. If I set up 10 different tanks, reef tanks, and I trace and I follow the trace element usage of those tanks with a very, very accurate mass spectrometer over time, I'm going to find two very interesting things. The first thing I'm going to find is that every single one of those tanks is going to use a different distribution of trace elements. So there are about 70 trace elements in natural seawater, and each of those 10 tanks is going to use different ones in different quantities.
Makes sense.
That's the first thing that we're going to find out that's interesting. The second thing that we're going to find out that's super cool is that there are 17 of those 70 trace elements that are going to be used in every single one of those 10 tanks. So what Tropic Marin does is to say, okay, I don't know what trace elements your tank is using, but I do know that it's using these 17. So it makes sense to put a little bit of those 17 trace elements back into the system.
Yeah.
Now, in my experience, ICP testing is somewhat inaccurate from test to test with the way we do it currently on these trace elements that we have in such minute quantities in reef tanks. It's very good with the big things like calcium and magnesium and potassium. It's really good with those. But when we get down to these ones that are in the tiniest of concentrations, I'm not so sure that the ICP testing that we do these days is accurate on a regular basis all the time. But it does make some sense if I know that if it's a reef tank, it's going to be using these 17 trace elements. Makes some sense to add a small amount of those 17 trace elements back into the system on a regular basis.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's what the Tropic Marin Trace A and Trace K does. I believe we're the only company that actually separates out those 17 that we know get used on a regular basis in all tanks into those two. So the Trace A is the 7 anions, the negative ions, and the Trace K is the 10 is made up of the 10 positive or cat ions of those 17. The reason we separate them into two products is because if we put them together, they tend to precipitate because they're positive and negative.
Okay.
So we separate them into two different products. So that is, to me, a very clear approach to trace elements because we're not indiscriminately throwing stuff in a tank that we can't measure how much we.
Okay. Now, so two questions. So you got the A and the K. You got the two different products that are the two different halves of the 17 that you know are used. You know that they are essential. So it's kind of easy, just down to 2, which is actually pretty good because most of the other ones are 4+ elements you got to dose. Now, could it be mixed with some of your other? I get this one a lot. Can you add it in with your, say, calcium, milk, and other stuff?
Yes. So if you're using the balling method, which is the 3-part ABC, you can actually add the trace A to the part B of the balling, and you can add the trace K to the part A of the balling.
Okay.
And the way you do it is you figure out how many milliliters of the, let's say, the trace A you want to add every day.
Mm-hmm.
You know how many milliliters of the balling B is going in the system every day.
Yep.
You know how many milliliters are in the holding container of the balling B.
Mm-hmm.
So you figure out how many milliliters of the trace B do I have to add to this full volume of the balling, of the trace A, do I have to add to the full volume of the balling B, so that when it puts in its 50 milliliters a day or whatever it puts in a day, it's putting in my, whatever it is, 4 milliliters of the trace A at the same time.
Okay, nice. Well, that's a good way to do it. Okay.
Now, the other really interesting one is when it comes to, so everybody's talking about our all-for-reef and our carbocalcium.
Yep.
All-for-reef already contains the trace A and the trace K. So you don't have to worry about it. If you're using the all-for-reef, you're already adding those trace elements.
Perfect.
The cool thing about the carbocalcium is that because the carbocalcium is very concentrated, this is the fluid now. So if you're using the carbocalcium powder, you mix it with RODI water, you end up with the carbocalcium fluid. You can actually add both the trace A and the trace K to the single carbocalcium fluid. And the reason it doesn't precipitate is because you're adding only a small amount. So if you add the A and K together to each other, you're adding two concentrated solutions. But if you add a little bit of the K and a little bit of the A to the carbocalcium, you're diluting those so they don't precipitate.
Okay.
So you can actually add the trace A and the trace K to the carbocalcium liquid after you make the powder into liquid, so that you now have a single solution that's dosing the calcium, the alkalinity, and the trace elements to the system. And again, the way you figure out how much to add is, let's say you want to add 5 milliliters of A and K every day to your system. You have your carbocalcium. You know how much carbocalcium is going in the system each day. Let's say there's 100 mLs of carbocalcium going in the system every day. You know how much carbocalcium is in your holding container. Maybe there's 4 liters or something. I don't know, 5 liters. You just do a calculation to figure how much A and K do I add to this 4 liters, so that every 100 milliliters has my 4 mLs of A and K in it when it goes into the system.
Okay. Now, when you're figuring out how much to dose, is that mainly because, you have to test, or is there kind of a general base rule that you say is dose this many mils per this much of your calcium milk, your AD?
Great question. So whenever you're starting with trace elements or carbon dosing in an established system, a system that's more than a couple of years old, by the way, you probably don't even need trace elements in a system that's under a year or a year and a half. Okay. So don't even worry about trace elements until your system, unless you've got unless it's stocked like your lagoon tank. Don't worry about trace elements until a system is about a year and a half, maybe even 2 years old.
Okay.
So now you've got an established system. It's more than 2 years old. It's never had the addition of trace elements or carbon dosing, or it's been using some other trace elements or some other carbon dosing, and you want to switch. Always start with a quarter of the recommended dose, and slowly over the course of a few months, work your way up. Now, the reason for that is, again, every tank is different. And just because we give you a recommended dose doesn't necessarily mean that's what your tank is going to need. The other thing that's important to realize, and this is true of both carbon dosing and trace element addition, and this is something I explain to so many people, and if I can get people that are listening to us today to understand this, it's a huge thing. We always like to say, we want this reef tank, we want it to be a perfect little chunk of the ocean, that we have in our living room or our basement or wherever we have it. It's not true. You want to create a total anomaly. You want to create a chunk of the ocean that grows all of the things that you think look really pretty and really cool, and doesn't grow any of the stuff that normally grows right next to that on a coral reef.
Yep.
If you go diving on any coral reef anywhere in the world, you will see green hair algae, bryopsis, cyanobacteria, dinoflagellates, all that bubble algae. You're going to see all that stuff that you don't want in your tank. And the reason is that it wants the same conditions that your corals want. And when we create a reef tank, we're trying to hit this sweet spot where the corals have everything that they need and want to grow and be beautiful, but we're not giving the bad guys the stuff that they want.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important to understand that they want the same thing that the good guys want.
Yeah.
So the takeaway from this is this. Sometimes when you change conditions in a reef tank, let's say you're missing a few trace elements. Let's say your manganese and your strontium and your vanadium are really, really low.
Mm-hmm.
And your corals are not happy. But the tank is pristine. There's no algae growing. It's gorgeous.
Yeah.
But you can see your corals are not happy. So you think, maybe I should try some trace element addition.
Mm-hmm.
So now you start putting trace elements. The corals are happy. But sometimes the algae is happy too. And sometimes when you add trace elements or carbon dosing, you start to grow the bad guys.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the takeaway from that. It doesn't mean you did anything wrong. In fact, it's a huge red flag that your corals did not have what they needed because the algae didn't have what it needed. And now you're giving the corals what they need, but the algae's having a party too. Mm-hmm. So that tells you that there was a deficiency in the system.
Yeah.
So here's the way around it. Here's what you do. You start with a quarter of a dose, and every month or two, you up it a little bit until you get up to the recommended dose. If during that period of time, you see the growth of anything undesirable, you immediately stop your addition. Now, here's what happens. If your reef system starts to grow bubble algae all by itself, it's going to be a bear to get rid of it. But if it starts to grow bubble algae because of something that you're adding to the system and you stop adding that stuff, the bubble algae dies.
Yeah.
And when it dies, it weakens. So if during this ramping up of your trace elements or your carbon dosing, because the same thing happens with carbon dosing sometimes, during your ramping up, if it starts looking like you're growing something you don't want, stop it immediately and don't freak out. Just let it die off. It's going to take 4, 5, 6 weeks for it to die, but let it die off. Then after it's dead and your tank is clean again, then start again with a quarter of a dose. Go back to square one and slowly start to work your way up again. Sometimes it takes 2, 3, 4 times of doing that until you get to the point where the algae is so weak that now it can't grow anymore, or the bacteria, whatever it is you're growing, and now you can get into the tank what you need to get into it.
Yeah.
But if you start to grow those bad guys, don't give up, because it means there was a deficiency in the tank. It's a dead giveaway that those corals didn't have something that they wanted.
So moral of the story is, if something bad does start coming up, cut it back a little bit, let it die off, then, you can slowly creep it up again over time.
No, cut it back altogether. If you start putting in trace A and trace K, and on the 3rd week you start growing green hair algae, and you've never
cut it
had
back
that
till it dies
before,
off.
stop your A and K altogether, take out as much of the hair algae as you can, and let it die off.
Yep.
Then go back to square one, quarter of a dose, and start again.
Gotcha. Okay. No, that makes sense. Okay, another question for you. This one's come up a few times now. So a lot of it we're talking about dosing with the balling. How about with a calcium reactor? A few of the questions were: doesn't the calcium reactor media provide trace elements? Would auto water chains provide with the Tropic Marin Pro? Would that provide enough, or would you still want to dose the trace on top of that? It's kind of a
So
three-parter.
two completely different questions. Let's take the water change one first because that's really easy. Water changes will do nothing for your trace elements, just like it does nothing for your calcium and alkalinity and magnesium. Let me put that in perspective for you. So let's say you're trying to maintain a 420 part per million calcium level. And let's say the tank drops to 380, okay? Let's say you do a 10, I'm going to keep the numbers really simple here just to make the point. Let's say you do a 10% water change with fresh mixed up Tropic Marin that has a calcium level of 420. So the tank is 380 and you're doing a 10% water change with 420, okay?
Yeah.
The difference between 420, your water change water, and your tank water, 380, is 40 parts per million.
Okay.
But you're only doing a 10% water change. That means on the one day that you do your water change, you changed your tank from 380 to 384.
And a day later, it's gone.
Yeah. Even if you do a 20% water change, you took it to 388. Okay. So think about this now. Let's say you've got an automatic water change system going and every day it changes a gallon of water. You're not helping anything. Yep. So water changes are very good at exporting bad nutrients. And I think water changes serve other functions as well. So I'm a big fan of water changes. But one thing they do not do well is to supplement anything.
Okay.
They just don't help unless you have a nano aquarium and you're doing a 90% water change every week.
Yeah.
Now you're supplementing. But if you have a larger reef system and you do a 10, a 20%, even a 30% water change, you're not doing much for supplementation. Okay.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about calcium reactors and calc reactors.
Yeah.
The calcium reactors, depending on the media, may or may not be good at adding trace elements. They're much better at adding calcium and alkalinity than they are at adding trace elements. And I will be totally honest with you, as I always am. We don't make calcium reactors, so I don't know a whole lot about them.
Okay.
I do know that I have seen a very positive change in a couple of systems that I've been working on helping people with that had calcium reactors where a very small addition of trace elements has made a difference. So maybe they're good at putting trace elements in, but not as good as they could be, or maybe some media is better than others. I'm not a real authority on them, so I don't know for sure, but I have seen some corals color up that in systems that had calcium reactors after getting a small trace element addition.
With one of my prior tanks, I had the calcium reactor and I purposely didn't dose anything for a few months. And then I wanted to see what it was dosing or not dosing for traces. And I'm not looking at this. It's been a few months since I looked at this, but I did an ICP test on it. And I think it was potassium and strontium and maybe molybdenum, something else that I was very low on from not dosing anything. So there's definitely some things that it is lacking.
Yeah, and potassium, by the way, you touched on potassium. We now have a potassium additive and a potassium test kit. Okay. And nice. I did not know the importance of potassium, but potassium, I'm on a learning curve like everybody else here. So turns out potassium is crucial in some of the enzymatic activity that goes on in the coral polyps. And if your potassium is much under that kind of 400 range, if it's way low, it can really affect the biological processes of the corals. I'm just learning more about it now, but it's an important thing to look at.
Well, that's a good one. One other thing too, when you just I thought of it, but when you were mentioning with dosing excessive amounts of trace elements, how the impact had on corals.
Yeah.
I know at one point I was overdosing it and I saw certain colors taking over in the tank, which was interesting. So it definitely can affect it.
Yeah, and in the long run, I think that you also then see the growth of undesirable algae. But a little bit of trace elements, it's certainly not one of those cases where more is better, but a little bit of trace elements can make a big difference in a system.
No,
especially an older system, by the way.
So you said earlier for the first year and a half, don't even bother with trace elements.
Yeah.
Now, basically, until your tank's full of coral, it's probably not a big issue, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's true. At the same time, I also think that there's a depletion that happens over time, where but in general, a younger tank is going to have less coral growth. Even if you just started that lagoon, okay?
Yep.
So you're probably not going to get the kind of accelerated growth in that lagoon for the first few months, even though it's so chock full of stuff. It's probably not going to be growing the way it did when it was in the system that was more established. And so I think that there's just kind of this natural progression of two things. One is that the corals kind of have to accommodate to the new conditions and start making changes so that they can regain the kind of growth rate that they had before. And also just empirically, newer systems generally don't have as many corals in them unless you're a nut like you are and completely throw everything in a brand new tank. In general, a newer system is not going to have as much stony coral in it as it does a year down the road.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That makes sense. Okay, quick question from the chat. Dramedy is asking, will trace elements affect salinity? Kind of like two-part does.
Yeah.
I'd imagine it'd be extremely minute if it did anything, but...
The answer is technically yes, but functionally no. The effect is so small that you'll never see it.
Okay, that's fair. Perfect.
And only certain trace elements, and frankly, I don't know which ones. I'm looking at a trace element list. I don't even know if I could say which ones, but I'm not a chemist, so sometimes these questions get above my head. My guess is that certain trace elements would actually affect salinity, but the reason they're called trace is because they're put in such small quantities that I doubt it would even be something that a mass spectrometer could measure.
Okay. Method was asking, what are the negative effects of overdosing trace elements? Personal experience, whatever the red and the orange was took over my tank. The most notable one that sticks out in my mind is my Rainbow Monty that was like greens and yellows and reds and oranges was almost all reddy orange.
Yeah.
So I lost my yellows and greens. So you could lose certain colors and certain ones could take over. That's been my personal experience with overdosing it.
Yeah, and I think the biggest negative effect that is generally seen with a trace element overdose is the growth of bad guys. You start growing the bubble algae or the hair algae or the cyanobacteria. At some point, there's so many trace elements there that you're really fostering the growth of some of the stuff you don't want.
That makes sense. Tom goes, I like the red CABCD harder overdose. That's actually exactly what I overdosed with, so it's definitely possible. And that's what happened when I neglected testing it for a long time.
I mean, I think, you can overdose just about anything.
Yep, anything. Doesn't matter what it is.
Yeah, the only thing that people often say to me, this or this happened and it killed my corals. There's very little that we add to reef tanks that can really kill corals quickly. The only thing that I really know of that can do that is iodine. If you drastically overdose iodine, yes, you can kill stuff in the short run. But most of everything else that we add to aquariums, no matter what it is, if it's going to negatively influence the health of the corals, it's going to take quite a long time to do that. It's usually not, you made the addition on Tuesday and the coral died on Thursday. If the coral died on Thursday, start looking at what happened last week Thursday or the week before. Corals are much tougher than we give them credit for. And if a coral is dying today, the thing that's making it die probably didn't happen yesterday. It probably
Fallout.
happened 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 weeks ago.
Hmm.
That and that's what's causing it to be to be dying. So
Yep.
when your corals are not looking good, don't think about what you did yesterday. Think about what you did last week and the week before.
Hmm. No, very, very true. They are hardy, but they don't like change. So it's usually is that follow. And it does take a while for things to kind of show itself. So,
Yeah, and they don't like change for a good reason. Keep in mind a coral polyp. Here's my little coral polyp here. A coral polyp is a creature that lives by osmosis and diffusion. So he equalizes everything inside of him with his environment that's outside of him. So if
mhm,
his environment outside changes quickly, then either water rushes into him or
mhm,
water rushes out of him. Either way, he's not going to be happy.
yeah.
And so you have to remember that these corals are, live by their membranes, and they live by diffusion and osmosis. And so even when you're going from bad conditions to better conditions, you want that change to be slow,
Mhm,
because if it's too rapid, the change within the coral polyp is too rapid, and and they don't like that. They either start to you either start to see RTN, or depending on what type of coral it is,
mhm,
you start to see some problems because they changed too quickly inside.
mhm,
And it's a hard thing to swallow sometimes if you suddenly do a test and you see that there's some problem with the parameters in your tank. You want to fix it quick. Yeah, it's like, man, I want to quickly get this resolved and get it back on track. That's not a good approach when you have a lot of corals. You
mhm.
want to go slowly, even when you're going from bad to good.
Yep. Nothing good happens fast. It's the truth there.
Nothing good happens fast.
No, very, very true. Okay, couple questions before they completely scroll away and I forget to ask them. Does trace elements have any specific dosing calculator? The alpha reef does not. Any word on this as well? The alpha reef has a. Does it have trace elements mixed in with it?
It does. The
Yeah.
alpha reef has magnesium, calcium, alkalinity, magnesium, and trace elements.
Okay.
And there's a recommended starting point dose on the alpha reef of 5 milliliters per 26 gallons per day.
Okay.
That's kind of your recommended dose. So if you don't have a lot of consumption in your tank and you're starting alpha reef, start with like 1 or 2 milliliters per 26 gallons. If you got a
Mhm.
really heavily stocked tank, maybe start with 5 or 6 milliliters per 26 gallons. It's just a starting point.
Okay.
I know Zach at Bulk Reef Supply has a ridiculously stocked tank,
Yep.
and he's been putting 3 times that in his tank every day.
And so far,
So
so good.
yeah, he's convinced. He's a convert. He drank the Kool-Aid.
A few
Drank
months
the
ago, when you were on, you said someone was excessively dosing over it. So it was Zach that was doing it. Yeah.
That was Zach that's doing it. Yeah. And
Nice.
I told him he's kind of my test subject on overdosing alpha reef to see if it makes a difference. It's just a starting point, and you
Mhm.
kind of go up and down from there. The important thing to kind of notice with alpha reef, and it's true of carbocalcium too, because they're both calcium formate products,
Mhm.
is that it's very good at raising the calcium in the water column. Okay, so if you add alpha reef or you add carbocalcium to your system, and an hour later you check the calcium level, it's
Mhm.
gone up percentage wise with how much you added. Not true of the alkalinity.
Okay.
What we're finding is that the alkalinity conversion in the calcium formate, a lot of it happens within the coral polyp. So another way to say it is that the alkalinity from carbocalcium and alpha reef both tends to go more directly into the coral rather than going through the water column and then into the coral. It kind of bypasses the water column. So you don't always see the rise in alkalinity in the water column that you see in the calcium numbers. So when you start with carbocalcium or olefirif, you want to start at the calcium and alkalinity numbers that you would like to have in the system, and let the olefirif and carbocalcium maintain those numbers, rather than starting with lower numbers and trying to increase it with the olefirif or the carbocalcium, because it's good at doing that with the calcium, but it's more effective at getting the alkalinity directly to the coral.
Yep.
Now, we went down a little rabbit hole, Devon, on the olefirif and the carbocalcium. That question that you just asked had another part to it, and I don't remember what it was. We answered half of it. We didn't answer the other half.
I already lost it. I've read like 4 other questions.
It was something about trace elements. Whoever sent that question in, if you want an answer to the other part of it, I know that there's a big piece of it we didn't answer. I'm sorry I went down that rabbit hole. Email me. Just send me an email to office@tropicmarin-usa.com. Once again, it's office@tropicmarin-usa.com. I'll be happy to answer that question for you. I'm sorry that I blanked on what the second part of it was.
Okay, perfect. And that's always appreciated. So Lou's also very easy to reach out to if you do have questions on using any of the products. He's always happy to help. Okay, here's another one. David's Reef. In your Tropic Marin balling C, does the trace elements be used up? I think we kind of touched on this one before, and I know it's not necessarily for dosing trace elements directly. I know you had a very big explanation on this. So I don't know if you want to kind of go back to that one a little bit, because this is semi around that one.
Well, since we've been on like way over an hour, I'll give you the short version of the answer. It is true. This is the big thing that's misunderstood about balling. And it's misunderstood because all the other companies that make balling products have the Part C supplement magnesium. And even some of them have it supplement some trace elements. However, that is not the balling method. In the balling method, in the true balling method, the way Hans Werner Balling designed it in 1994 and revised it in 1996, in the true balling method, the Part C does one thing and one thing alone. It balances ionically the leftover sodium chloride that is created and left over by the parts A and B. It does not supplement magnesium, and it does not supplement trace elements. Very hard to understand because it has magnesium and trace elements in it. So how can it not be supplementing?
Makes sense on confusion.
The reason it doesn't supplement it is because you're only adding enough to offset and balance that sodium chloride that's created by the part A and B. If you go to YouTube and you look up the balling method, you'll see the video that I put up that explains this, and I have Hans Werner Balling narrating it. And also, if you hit the caption, because sometimes it's a little hard to understand his English, if you hit the caption, I've got English captions under it, and it'll show you exactly how the balling method works. I hate to say this, but a lot of the explanation of the balling method that's out there is not correct. I learned what I know about the balling method from Hans Werner Balling himself. And so what I'm telling you is what he would tell you.
It's direct from the source, not the telephone game. I like it.
Absolutely. And in fact, it's not a good idea to use the Part C to supplement for magnesium and trace elements, because the Part C has all the trace elements in it. And as I explained before, you don't want to add all 70 trace elements. You want to add the ones that we know are going down. And that's those 17 that we put into A and K. So you only use the Part C to iodically balance this leftover sodium chloride from the parts A and B in the balling method. You still have to add magnesium, and you still have to add trace elements.
Okay. All right. Now here's another good question, which I am not 100% clear on, so maybe you will be. iodide vs iodate vs iodine dosing.
Yeah, if you're going to dose a tank with iodine, now that's as opposed to doing an iodine dip, all right? You want to use Lugel's iodine. Now, it doesn't matter what company you buy it from as long as it says Lugel's, because Lugel's is the formula I2. It can't be anything else if it says Lugel's. All of the Lugel's solutions that are on the market are the same. They're all I2. They can't be anything different if it says Lugel's. To be honest, I forget which is iodide and which is iodate.
Okay.
But it is the Lugel's, and you could look up Lugel's to see whether it's the iodide or the iodate, but it's Lugel's that you want to use for addition to your tank.
Okay.
And then you use the other one when you're doing a coral dip.
Okay, so I2 is for supplementation, and then whatever the other one is for the dipping.
Correct.
Okay, perfect. I have seen a few companies that had both. I'm like, what's the difference?
Yeah, it's the Lugel's that you want to use for supplementation. And remember, if you're putting in 2 drops a day and you're going on vacation for 14 days, you can't put 28 drops in before you leave. Iodine is the one thing that we cannot do that with.
Okay. No, that's a good one. All right. So, Derek, my concern with trace elements under/overdosing, it's better to be on the low side than overdosing, in personal opinion.
Yes.
Would ICP test bi-weekly or something be able to provide the correct dosage? That's a lot of ICP tests, and it is questionable because they are not 100%.
Yeah, my experience is that the current methods, there's not all ICP testing is the same. And the type of ICP testing that is currently used in the aquarium trade, in my opinion, kind of loses its accuracy when we get down to these minute little things. When we start looking at, I'm looking at my trace element, important trace element types here. When we start looking at things like lithium numbers, nickel numbers, manganese numbers, when we start looking at these, and zinc numbers, when we start, actually, in my experience, it's been pretty good with zinc. But when we start looking at these really minute numbers, I just haven't seen the accuracy on a regular basis. And so that's why we choose this different approach, which is unlike the Zeovit approach, which is, measure everything and add each individually what you need, which I'm not putting that approach down, by the way. Our approach is, it's kind of hard to measure this stuff. I know your tank is using these 17. Let's put a little bit of those 17 in.
Yeah. So here's
I agree with Derek's statement. Less is more with trace elements.
Yeah. No, it's better to just, when I was dosing, I was just doing a half dose of just, the main little concoctions. But yeah, overdosing, trouble, having some in there is better than having none. So
absolutely.
Yeah. As most things, it's always better to start a little dose and work your way up slowly over time and make sure there's no negative effects.
See how your tank reacts to it. That's the ultimate thing. That's the ultimate test. Not every tank is going to react to any single stimulus the same way. So you have to just I even know the tanks that I've had, they've all been different. They all react differently. There's very few generalities in the small things, and sometimes not even good generalities in the big things. So you really have to just watch your system. Your system better than anybody. You watch the system and take your cues from what your system is showing you.
And that's really what makes someone like an experienced reefer, is just that time and, knowing your system. You see something change, you're like, okay, why is it doing that? Or once you see it happen before, like, okay, this is happening. Maybe I'm low on this, or maybe this is happening. It's just, yeah.
It's also the fun of the hobby.
Yep.
To me, is it depends a lot on, that reef system depends a lot on you looking at it, observing it, and knowing that, geez, that hammer doesn't look as good as it has for the last few weeks. What's going on? Maybe I need to move it. Maybe it's in low flow. Maybe it's in high flow. Maybe it needs more light. Maybe it needs less light. I don't know. But doing that and getting through that stuff, that's the fun of the hobby.
Oh, it is. And actually, one good one, you said hammers. One that's a good indicator call for me is Dunkins. If the Dunkins aren't happy, I know something's not right in the tank, because they're usually one of the first ones that won't be as fluffy and showing it.
Yeah.
So it's good to have those. All right, one more question for you here. So Mark was asking, hey, Lou, was mixing up part C of the balling method powder with a magnetic stir device, and some of the metal flakes appeared after the solution was mixed. Is this common or a possible contaminant?
Not usually in the part C. Well, first of all, you don't usually see anything metallic at all. That's not something that you would normally see. I'd love to see a picture of it. You do very often see that the part B doesn't fully dissolve. In fact, I've talked with Hans Werner about this a number of times, because the part B never seems to, or very often doesn't fully dissolve. And he says, no problem, it's still a super saturated solution. But it shouldn't be a metallic thing.
Okay.
And so what I would say is, send me an email with a picture of it if you can, Mark. Again, the email address is office@tropicmarin-usa.com. And send me a picture if you can of what's in there. I would take a look at the powder itself. There shouldn't be anything metallic in it. Try running a magnet over some of the powder and see if you get anything. I'd be really curious to see what you find, but I don't know where a contaminant would have come from, but there certainly shouldn't be anything metal or metallic in there.
Yep. One thing that you just touched on a second ago was with, I think it's the part B you said, or one of them that doesn't fully dissolve sometimes. Is that just because it's reached its saturation point where it's literally all it's going to take in?
Yeah. And again, this comes up a lot. It doesn't come up a lot, but I've had a number of questions about it, and I've asked Hans Werner about it a number of times, and he says that sometimes it reaches its saturation point and it just won't go in any further. He says it doesn't affect the concentration. It doesn't affect the effectiveness of the product at all. It's just you sometimes see that happen.
Okay. And I know some things I've read before where they would use like heated or do other things to try and make it melt a bit more. Does that make much of a difference, do you find, or is it not even worth the effort?
I personally think that in theory, warming it should make a difference. But in practice, it doesn't seem to do much unless you would have to get it really hot, which, doesn't make sense. So, in functionally, no, it doesn't make much difference.
Okay, well, that's fair. I've always actually used those little magnetic stirrers for mixing chemicals because they make your life so much easier. I know that I've seen ones with heated build plates, but I've never bothered with those. I just got the standard issue little magnetic ones.
Yeah, they work great.
Especially for magnesium, because that one never dissolves easily. That one's always a bugger. Just let it run for a while and you're good. Okay, I am not going to keep you all night because I've already had you on for an hour and 20 minutes. So I appreciate you coming on, Lou.
No problem. It's always a pleasure. I love doing your show, Devon. I'll do it anytime you like.
Awesome. Much appreciated. I'm going to take you up on that one every couple of months because I love having you on. So
yeah, just shoot me an email and I'm always happy to do it.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you so much. I mean, guys, if you enjoyed this today, hit that thumbs up button. Thank Lou. I'm sure we're going to have lots of good stuff in the comments later. But yeah, it was an awesome stream today. And thanks again so much for coming on.
All right, Devon, great to see you. And we'll do it again soon.
Sounds good. Thanks so much. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.